Hello and welcome to Opposition. So Opposition is a 4-mana enchantment that lets us tap our guys to tap their stuff. It's super annoying if we tap their lands in upkeep because they can only float mana for instant speed effects, and if we tap their creatures, then of course it makes combat really difficult for them. We can also use Tradewind Rider as a way to bounce anything that does come into play, but of course for all of this we need a lot of creatures. And that is where Deranged Hermit comes into play. So for 5 mana, this card gives us 5 bodies. So you can just tap down a whole army worth of stuff with it straight away. It's also worth saying there are 2 versions of this, the much more common and competitive survival version and the Squirrel version. But the Squirrel version does not actually play squirrels anymore, it's just the more traditional opposition strategy, but Squirrel Nest, unfortunately, it's a bit too slow and clunky for Premodern. So we still have the iconic deck, it's just a bit different. The creatures that we play, of course we have a lot of mana ramp creatures because they're great in the early game, they help us get our opposition and Tradewind Rider out quickly, and we can turn them into tappers during the mid to late game. Also, the survival versions play all of the usual survival suspects, Squee to keep recurring himself, Oromancer to return the survival if they kill it, Quirion Ranger to just help speed everything up, and Mastercore to kill creatures. These builds also commonly splash another colour, meaning you can play all of the toolbox creatures from that colour or multicolour cards. I've chosen white here because it's the most common, but you just play whatever you think is the most fun. So Shapeshifter has all the abilities of the top card of our graveyard as long as it's a creature, and we're going to use that with Phyrexian Devourer. Devourer has the ability to exile the top card of our deck and then put that many +1/+1 counters on itself. When it gets to a power of 7, you have to destroy it. So in this case, with Devourer in the graveyard, we can pump the Shapeshifter, and then when it gets to 7 power, we can respond to the destroy trigger by pumping it a whole lot more times, making it bigger than our opponent's life total. What we'll do then, once it's bigger than our opponent's life total, is we'll discard a Triskelion to the survival. That will change the Shapeshifter's abilities, so it has the ability to remove +1/+1 counters to shoot things for 1, meaning we can shoot their entire board and their life total and just win the game on the spot. All of this will happen before the 7 power berry trigger. It's all instant speed. So this also means we can play the Hypnox combo. Hypnox is a super cool creature that when it comes into play, it removes our opponent's hand from the game. Then when it leaves play, they get their hand back. Of course, it costs a lot of mana, but we're going to cheat this effect in early with Shapeshifter. So as long as Hypnox is in our graveyard, the Shapeshifter will retain the comes into play ability, removing our opponent's entire hand from the game. Then all we need to do is discard any card and just change the top card of our graveyard, and that will remove the leaves play ability from the Shapeshifter, meaning their hand is removed from the game permanently. For the Squirrel versions, of course we don't have any of these survivals. We don't play Squirrel Nest anymore, as I mentioned before, but we do still play Call of the Herd. This one still is fast enough to give us the bodies that we need, and it goes very well with Opposition and Tradewind Rider. Also, all of the decks play Disruption. The Squirrel version will play the full 4 copies of Winter Orb and 4 of Tanglewire, whereas the Survival version will play maybe 2 of each and some kind of tutor effect. It's also worth mentioning the errata on Winter Orb means that its effect only works as long as it's untapped, meaning we can tap it with Opposition to allow us to untap all of our stuff, and then when it untaps, they won't be able to untap their stuff. So the traditional versions or Squirrel versions will play Impulse or some kind of Fact or Fiction card draw effect. Whatever you like really, it's up to you. And for lands, both versions play all of the blue-green lands you'd expect in a blue-green deck, but the survival versions play more multicolour fixing, such as City of Brass or Windswept Heath, whereas the Squirrel or more traditional versions play manlands such as Treetop Village, or something like Guy's Cradle to really pump the mana out. If you'd like to splash a different colour, I think the most common is probably black. Cabal Therapy goes really well in this kind of go wide strategy. Psychotog is also a super powerful card, and so is Shadowmage Infiltrator. For the sideboard, the survival versions play all of the survival targets and multicolour cards that you'd expect in those colours. Nothing really to say here. And while the traditional builds don't have any of these survival targets, they do still have additional copies of the red hate, such as Chill or Pyroblast. They have some kind of like life gain effects, and they do still have Naturalize. Of course, they'll play more copies because they're not running the toolbox. When playing this deck, most of the time you want to just land an opposition or a Tradewind Rider as quickly as possible, and then just start tapping and bouncing all of their stuff. If you're going for the survival build, of course you can just go for the combo wins as quickly as possible too. Again, as I mentioned before, you can keep this lock going by tapping your own Winter Orb, meaning you get the full untaps while they don't. And against the deck, the two main ways to target it are either targeting the creatures or targeting the artifacts and enchantments. If you're playing against the survival build, then you will need to bear that combo in mind as well. Some decks also have natural resilience to this strategy, such as decks that can go off at instant speed, such as Storm or Burn, as well as very fast combo decks that can kill us before our enchantments and trade wins come online. Now, this is a mid-range deck, leaning more on the controlling side. Against aggro decks, we're just trying to survive the early onslaught and then use opposition or Tradewind Rider to lock them out of the game. This is especially difficult against burn decks though. Against control decks, we're kind of trying to do a similar thing, we're just trying to lock them out of their sorcery speed spells with opposition. The strengths of the deck would be the toolbox, and it can include some very nice combos. It also has a very strong late game once we get opposition going. It's very good against slow decks. However, the weakness is it is quite slow itself. It can be fragile as it does rely on those enchantments, and instant speed just gets around everything we're trying to do. So here's an example of the more competitive toolbox version, and here is the more traditional. I've called it Squirrel build, but actually it doesn't really play squirrels. And as always, I do recommend checking out TC decks. This video did take me a while to make, so if you like it, please do subscribe, comment. Thank you for watching.